I recall my homiletics professor in the seminary, a Vincentian priest named Father Charles Miller, or we called him Charlie Miller, born in New Orleans, taught for many, many years in the seminary in Los Angeles, an avid baseball fan and even a Dodgers fan, so he'd be happy after this last week. And in teaching us homiletics, how to preach, how to present the Word of God, one advice I remember him giving us, and he gave it to us more than once, when he said, no priest in his right mind would preach the gospel on the Sunday following November 2nd, 1963. Because the gospel was not on anyone's mind. Another event was, of course, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I remembered that on the Sunday following 9/11, my first year, let's just say my first 4 months as a priest. But not just the tragedies. I'm sure homilies were somewhat adjusted the Sunday following the landing on the moon and other great important events that just were on people's minds. And let's face it, folks, on Sundays such as this, there's very few things that are on our mind that have little to do with the upcoming election. Our prayers for our country, our hopes for its future. And in case you're beginning to get tense right now, I'm already seeing some distant looks in people's eyes. I am not going to come up here telling us how we should vote. So relax, don't worry. But the election is not necessarily devoid of relevance where our gospel reading today is concerned. A few years back, the United States Catholic bishops put together a document on forming one's conscience to exercise proper citizenship. And at the heart of it was encouraging us as citizens to exercise our right to vote. In fact, we have a moral obligation to participate in such events because we are citizens of this country and we all have a duty to contribute to its well-being and its progress into the future. And in fact, the document says our duty to vote is at the heart of what it means to love our neighbor, quoting Christ's words in the gospel itself. So maybe it's no coincidence that the timing being what it is, this is the gospel we hear. And the bishops encourage us to form our consciences, and I think we all know the non-negotiables. I won't get into it in terms of the questions of life, questions of human dignity, and so on, matters of justice, at least a concern for the poor in our midst, and so on. But in forming our consciences, we also need to form ourselves as citizens in being informed voters so that we can make a good decision, a well-informed decision as we go to the polls. Because in many ways, how elections turn out can in fact have an impact on our lives as people of faith and even our progress as a church in any country. And so as citizens, it's important for us to be informed of the issues, who the candidates are, and in many ways to rise above what has sometimes become the very fiery rhetoric we hear, the vitriol that we hear election after election. It seems it gets worse and worse with each election, and I would say it probably began back in the 90s, the mid-90s. We really saw the nature of elections in this country come to the point where there's a cynicism that we feel growing inside of us and a desire to see it over. There's little joy in elections anymore. And there's a real desire to, we're happy it's over, and of course we're either happy with the outcome or we're not. But in some ways we see the approach that people take to an election that perhaps as Christians and especially as Catholics, to examine how we do so as to approach this as responsible citizens and faithful Catholic Christians. Because I believe very sincerely we will answer for how we vote in the election. And many people, under the auspices of separation of church and state, which the American style is mainly a protection of the church against intrusion of the state, not a protection of the state against the church. Many people see the ballot box as kind of an anti-Christian confessional, where we can be contrary to our faith with impunity, or the realm of politics to be almost an anti-religious biodome in which all things religion must not penetrate. But when you think of it, that's really not possible if we are electing human beings, people of faith, of various faiths, mostly a Christian faith, whose faith we hope will influence their leadership as the people we vote for and the people we elect. And that is at the heart of what the Founding Fathers desired, because they wanted freedom of religion to be a part of this nation. We see even in the Constitution itself the no religious test clause. Those who hold office on the state level and the federal level are to take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution, but no religious test is ever to be administered as a qualifier for public office. They wanted people in public office to be loyal to the Constitution, but not disloyal to their faith. They wanted that in the collective body of people who lead our country to be an influence. And when you think of it, when people say, even cynically, politics and corruption go hand in hand, isn't it true that the ethics that come with us as a people of faith would be a check on that? Something that might move people away from the tendency toward corruption in politics if they're faithful to the faith they profess in giving their leadership. And so let's not go into this election ashamed of being people of faith, but let it truly inform how we vote in various ways. First of all, for many people, unfortunately, they vote the way many of us root for a football team. They will never not vote for a particular party. They may not know the candidates. They certainly don't know the issues. They just look for that letter after their name. It's not just this country, but I've even seen it in elections in England and other democracies where people say, we've got a long family tradition in voting for this particular party, so I'll always vote for that party. And that's pretty much as far as they take their consideration in an election. Another thing we hear a lot about is, someone once recently asked me, doesn't character mean anything to me when I vote? And I say, well, yes, character is important, but policy is also important. I'm not voting for prom king or prom queen. There is a certain popularity in it, but at the same time, we need to be aware of policy. And my favorite example, loving U.S. history like I do, is seen in a previous president named James Polk from the 1840s. A one-term president who fulfilled his promises in one term, stepped down, and then died 3 months after he left office, shortest post-presidential tenure in our history. He's not as well known, but if it hadn't been for his presidency, I probably would not exist, because he was the president who got California as a territory and then ultimately as a state. And I had a grandfather who was born in Chicago, eventually moved to California where he met my grandmother, gave birth to my dad who met my mom in California, and there's where I was born. So thank God for the presidency of James K. Polk, but if you read any history on him, he was a real son of a gun to work with. A real pain in the neck. A very difficult man, a very hard politician, and a very hard driver. We didn't have radio and TV for people to see it firsthand, but they said he was a real SO you-know-what to work with. And yet, thank God for his presidency, at least as far as I'm concerned. So personality and character are important, but at the same time, we also need to look at policy. But perhaps most importantly, at least for me in this election, comes from what our Holy Father commented when it came to the election here in the United States. And his comment was, Catholics in this election just need to vote for the lesser of two evils. And that struck me, because what does that express in terms of a disposition one goes into in approaching this election? Many of us are perhaps familiar with the metaphor of the glass of water, filled not quite to the brim with water, and then there are those who would say the glass is half empty, and those who would say the glass is half full. I would add two more to that. I would say there are those who would say the glass is all empty, ignoring what water is in there, or overly optimistically saying, well, the glass is all full, ignoring that it's only half full. And we see the optimism and pessimism connected with those dispositions. And to hear someone express a notion in an election, it isn't just the Holy Father, but many people, even among our Catholic faith, who say, I'm just choosing the lesser of two evils. Or as one relative of mine a few years back when he was old enough to start voting, at one point said, I'm not even going to vote because they're all crooks anyway. I think connotes a cynicism that's conducive and kind of similar to the glass is half empty, connotes a cynicism that is not entirely compatible with our faith as Christians. It expresses a very negative, almost hopeless attitude toward us as a people, our nation, our church, and its history, our values, our identity, to simply write something off as we've gotten so far off that we only have the lesser of two evils to choose from. But as Christians, we also are a people of hope. We are a people of a positive outlook on our life, on our world. Because yes, we are sinners, but we are also saved. We are also redeemed. We're living in a world that is very, very messed up, but we are also living in a world in which Christ has come to live in it and continues to live in it. And in that we have a deep faith and deep hope. And I believe that's the disposition we need to go into even when approaching an election. It's the difference between saying, I'm just choosing the lesser of two evils, and looking closely to choose the better candidate running for office. Let me give you a couple of examples, again, without telling you who to vote for. Because my main thrust is, what's the disposition we're going into this election? On the state level, we have our governor's race. Here at Corpus Christi, and many, if not all, the Catholic schools and private schools throughout Indiana have really benefited from school choice over these last few years. Some families, even here at our school, if not all of them, are benefiting from that and truly value parents having that ability to choose the school where their children go. If we'd like to see that continue in the state of Indiana, then there is not a lesser of two evils among the candidates for governor. There is a better candidate who will see that program continue to the benefit of our families, even right here in Corpus Christi Parish. On the federal level, if, like me, we value our nation, our nation's history, including our history in overcoming our shortcomings, the principles on which our nation was founded, if we have a very positive view of our country, if we value freedom as opposed to political correctness, regulation on what we do, what we say, and how we even think, and especially for me as a priest, obviously, if we truly value our first freedom, which is not freedom of speech, but freedom of religion, the very first freedom mentioned in our Bill of Rights, a freedom which we see under assault, and a freedom for which I believe as Catholics we are bound to protect as citizens and voters, then there is not a lesser of two evils in this election. There is a better candidate for us to vote for. We may not like that person. They may not have the best personality in the world. But there is a better candidate. So I'm not criticizing our Holy Father for his approach. He is reflecting what I see a lot of in our nation today, a cynicism that as an American, and especially as a Christian, I really don't like to see. We are not a people who look at a glass and say the glass is half empty. And nor should we be people who approach election of simply saying we're choosing the lesser of two evils because they're all crooks anyway. Let us be people who embrace that principle we hear in today's gospel, to love our neighbor as we love our God. And as we exercise our privilege and our duty, and as the church would say, our moral obligation to vote and contribute to policy that we hope will be beneficial to the common good, let us not approach it with an attitude that the glass is half empty, or that we're choosing the lesser of two evils. But in forming our conscience as Catholics and forming ourselves as informed voters, let us truly strive to have a positive outlook of our nation and its future, a hope in the citizens who have always risen to the occasion, a hope that we see in our history as a nation when we ask ourselves, compared to such things as the French Revolution, how did we get so lucky? Many people will say the French Revolution was the superior revolution. I'll argue that till the day I die. The French Revolution was very atheistic, The American Revolution acknowledged the higher power in its founding documents. The French Revolution produced Robespierre. Ours produced Thomas Jefferson. Yes, he owned slaves, but Robespierre's leadership led to tens of thousands of people being guillotined during the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution produced Napoleon. Ours produced George Washington. Yes, George Washington owned slaves. But Napoleon, on the heels of the French Revolution, crowned himself emperor and plunged Europe and much of the world into a world war that lasted over a decade and cost how many lives? George Washington, after the Revolution, turned over his sword to the leadership of our nation, and when he was called again to serve as our first president, gave up the reins of power after 2 terms and retired. How did we get to be so lucky? When our nation was descended into civil war, how did we come up with a hick lawyer, a 1-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln? And yet his leadership saved our nation, saved our union, freed the slaves, and began us as a nation who couldn't imagine that institution ever existing, ever, let alone as part of our nation's history. And yet, in the past, civil wars have rarely come out so well for the nations, during which we managed to conduct an election, and the president was reelected during a civil war. How did we get so lucky? Recently, someone asked me in regard to one of our candidates, I won't name which, but they asked me, "Father, do you think God is on that candidate's side?" I said, "I don't think God is on either candidate's side. But I believe God is on America's side. We owe a great deal to God's blessing of this country. And as such, we owe it to God to be faithful to what we believe and truly exercise responsible citizenship of our nation in the upcoming election." Many of you may have already voted. Some of you are waiting for Election Day. I voted yesterday for the first time I've ever gone to the polls. I used to vote by mail in California. But as we prepare for this election, let us truly offer our prayers for our nation. But pray for ourselves that what we see in the growing attitudes of our electoral system and growing attitudes toward our country, even among our youth, that we don't descend into a cynicism, but rather enter into this election with the hope and the faith of Christians, in which the glass is half full and can only continue to grow in fullness by our presence in our society. So let us continue to pray for our nation, pray for our church, pray that we will exercise good citizenship, pray that our freedom of religion, first and foremost, is protected, but pray that as we continue to progress as a nation, that we be faithful to our founding principles in our nation's establishment and our Christian principles as people of faith.